such a big part of everything we do here. And of course, General Clark and the whole USERPAC team. Tremendous honor. And so what I'd like to do today is give you maybe a sense of the historical piece of the puzzle and a little bit of longer term perspective, context for something, for a lot of the issues we're wrestling with here today and this entire week. So when it comes to the Army and the Pacific Asia theater, I mean, the Army has to some extent been there, done that, especially in World War II. And so I'd like to maybe bring that to light a little bit and give you a sense of where we are as of 80 years ago when 1945 begins. So let's see if we get our, there we go. I teach at a technological university, so I always find a way to screw up the technology. Let's hope today is different. As General Brown had mentioned, I did a trilogy about the Army and the Pacific Asia theater, and this is the third volume. And so my talk today is a little bit of a variable from that. I'm going to focus particularly on the invasion of Luzon. So you're looking here, of course, at this tyranny of distance we've been talking about. And obviously that hasn't changed one bit, has it? So the Army was dealing with that, of course, in 1945, and at pretty much any place on our map that we're looking at there, you've got some sort of Army representation. It is absolutely staggering. And so when the year begins, there are about 1.4 million Army soldiers somewhere on our map there. And by the end of the war, about 1.8 million Army ground soldiers are going to serve in the Pacific Asia theater. I'm talking about just the ground soldiers. That does not include the Army Air Forces, which probably, as you know, the Air Force is part of the Army back then. So it's just the ground forces. The larger perspective of where this military force fits into the context of American history, well, that's the third largest military force this country has ever sent overseas for any purpose, much less to fight a war. The third largest, behind only the World War I and World War II European theater armies. So it's a staggeringly large and complex, and I would argue by 1945, formidable army that is, at that point, probably the most effective land arm on the planet. And it is, at that point, involved in just this multiplicity of missions and skill sets and capabilities that are just almost hard to wrap your mind around. It's guys like these, ordinary GIs who have banded together to create a pretty extraordinary organization. So about 42,000 of these soldiers would not survive the war. They form the plurality of American deaths in the war against Japan. There were about 111,000 deaths in the war, 42,000 of whom were for Army ground soldiers. So coming from an organization that is carrying out this incredible range of missions, strategic planning, inter-allied coordination, inter-service coordination, which of course you're going nowhere without the Navy, as we just saw on the map. How do we figure all these things out? The Army had gotten very, very good at that. The joint operations with the Marine Corps as well. The logistics that are just absolutely off the chart. We had a fascinating panel yesterday about logistics, and of course, so many of the things discussed yesterday reminded me of what the Army was dealing with back in World War II. Transportation on a scale that they really had never seen before. The Army got into the water business, in a way, the watercraft business, and we discussed that yesterday too. Engineering on a scale that had never been seen until that point in history, and same with medical care too. And guerrilla warfare. And oh, by the way, combat operations of every type and description that is just, happening in some of the most inhospitable places on the planet, where just existing is a challenge, much less sustaining combat operations. So I want to just sort of take you into one example of that, the invasion of Battle of Luzon, which of course happens in 1945, and is the largest battle of the Pacific War in 1945. It is a larger, and I would argue probably more complex battle than the more famous battles of Okinawa and Iwo Jima that were happening more or less at the same time. So where to begin, of course, with that discussion, I think, is with the guy who will be the mastermind of it, who we just heard about a moment ago, Douglas MacArthur. So as you see, if you're looking really sharp-eyed at our picture here, he's a 5-star general by this point in the war. So he is in control of what's called the Southwest Pacific Area, or SWAPA theater. It's a theater command. And of course, he needs very little introduction in this room, but he is, I would say, complex to the point of convolution. Close aide once said of him, none of us really knew MacArthur. We all saw fragments of the man, and I think that's so true. He was remarkably courageous, he was epically conniving, but he believed with an almost like evangelical intensity that America's future lay in Asia and the Pacific, and specifically that the Philippines must be liberated. If there's a bigger word than crusade, that would be it for the way MacArthur felt about liberating the Philippines. And he has then two key instruments in carrying out this plan. One of whom you see on the left there, Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, who commands 6th Army, that will have the lead role in the invasion of Luzon. So he is standing, by the way, next to Vice Admiral Tommy Kincaid, and that's a little insight into the combined service team that MacArthur has built by this point in the war. Kincaid, the commander of the 7th Fleet, has become a very strong partner of MacArthur, and of course of Kruger's as well. Kruger, by the way, was an immigrant, German immigrant, who joined the Army at age 17 in 1898 and would retire about a half a century later as a 4-star general. Remarkable guy on many levels, and of course had worked his way all the way up through the ranks. He, in terms of personality, could be quite brusque, he could be rude, but he was also honest, he was solid, he was sensible, he was an excellent planner, and he was quite methodical, though, in his operational outlook. So he is the commander of 6th Army, and then MacArthur's other Army commander is Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, who is very, very different operationally than Kruger, and has the West Point pedigree, which Kruger does not have. Eichelberger was West Point class in 1909, same class as his good friend George Patton, who of course is better known than Eichelberger, but operationally they were so incredibly similar. And they kept in touch. They were good friends, actually. They had interesting correspondence during the war. And when they were actually a few years earlier promoted to general around the same time, Patton wrote to Eichelberger and he said, "I'm glad the U.S. Army had the good sense to promote the best two officers in the U.S. Army to general." So with Eichelberger, you get a lot of the Patton aggressiveness without a lot of the personal drama. He is, in terms of his personality, warm, witty, makes friends easily, and he's very aggressive operationally, a lead from the front kind of commander. He and Kruger had developed quite a rivalry by now because they're personality-wise, they're very different, and operationally, they're somewhat different too. MacArthur realizes this, and so he's going to play one off against the other to get the best results he can in the Philippines campaign. So when the invasion happens, it's January 9th, 1945. It was called S-Day. So look at that map just for a second, and you can see just the vastness of this operation. This is 4 divisions landing in one day. Think of all the shipping that takes. Think of all the sea lanes you must control, the logistics that must sustain this. This is, by the way, more ground combat power that we're putting ashore here at Lingayen Gulf in Luzon than we had, as Americans, put ashore at Normandy in the more famous Normandy invasion the year before. So massive, and then you look at all the follow-on forces too. MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area had become the 2nd largest command globally, behind only Eisenhower at this point in the war. So it was quite massive. By now, of course, the Allies control the air and the sea, which is going to help you get ashore, and the Japanese understand that. So they're basically, their response to the approach of the fleet is kamikaze suicide attacks, which had begun the previous fall in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. They're not able to sink any ships, but they damage 24 and they kill over 500 sailors. So they leave a bite, but they're not able to stop the invasion. The Japanese plan is basically to hunker down inland in some of the good defensible terrain and bleed the Americans. What that will do for them strategically is that perhaps the Americans will lose the will to continue the war to the full unconditional surrender and occupy Japan and end the empire and all these kinds of things. So that's the idea. 6th Army gets ashore with those 4 divisions, but once ashore, and to refer to yesterday's logistical panel, logistics are now the thing once ashore, because the problem now is unloading the freight, moving the supplies, developing airfields, reconstructing roads. There are 11,000 short tons of ammo and supplies moving across the beaches every day. It's a major job to develop depots and rail lines. And so 6th Army is dealing with that logistical piece every bit as much as just simply trying to advance and deal with the Japanese resistance, which is negligible for the initial invasion, but eventually starts to stiffen as the Americans begin to advance northward and southward. So at that stage then, you were talking about developing those rail lines, those nodes of communication, those nodes of transportation, all those kinds of things that are the nettling details of war. And the Americans at this point, and I think this is a very, very important point to grasp here, are going to look to the Filipinos for the key to this whole thing. The Filipinos are absolutely front and center in their own liberation, and it's very important to understand that. Obviously, Filipino guerrilla groups had been fighting very hard, some of them for years by this point in time, against the Japanese. Some Filipinos are fighting as more conventional fighters alongside the American formations, but also, and I think this tends to get overlooked, Filipino civilians and others who are simply working to help with the logistical side, to move supplies, to unload freight, to help build airfields, so on and so forth, in addition to a largely friendly population that is a huge force multiplier. So, where does this lead? As we get a little bit of closer look, you've got 2 corps now ashore. What was called in those days I Corps, now we call it 1st Corps. They're going to hold that northern flank. 14th Corps, under the one of the most underrated commanders of the war, Major General Oscar Griswold, is then going to have the main role of advancing to Manila. There's 2 key objectives we've got to have: Clark Field, which later becomes Clark Air Force Base, and of course Manila itself. Manila obviously is a key objective no matter what, because of it's the capital and the symbolism, but it's about so much more than that. It's about the logistics again. The port of Manila is so necessary to sustain this massive ground force that we are going to have there. Okay, so that is the game. And MacArthur's going to end up very frustrated in those weeks after Este, when Kruger's advance is slower than he would want. 14th Corps is advancing maybe 2 to 3 miles a day against mixed resistance, but the problem is one of bridging. 217 bridges are out between the invasion beaches and the environs of Manila. Think about what that means for the engineers to have to do all that rebuilding and rebridging and rehabbing. So this is a serious issue that they have to deal with. But also, Kruger just is simply not wired to have a bold dash kind of advance. He is a methodical commander. And I would argue, and I do in my series, that if MacArthur's frustrated with Kruger, which he will be at this point, he'll even locate his headquarters ahead of Kruger's to try and shame him into moving faster, unsuccessfully. If he's mad at Kruger, he should be mad at himself, because he's miscast his commanders. If you want that quick dash, Eichelberger's your guy. And so, grasping that in a way, he decides, all right, I'm going to have Eichelberger and 8th Army control the 11th Airborne Division, and they're going to invade. And I apologize to our Filipino friends for my horrid pronunciation, Nasugbu. This is January 29th, 1945, in an outflanking invasion to come around from the south of Manila. Now, this is an actual, just a piece of artwork in operational control of a campaign. Eichelberger and Major General Joe Swing, the commander of the 11th Airborne, will outfight, outwit, outthink the Japanese at every turn, have this kind of narrow 65-mile supply line. They'll have a successful airborne drop and then move into the southern environs of Manila. Problem is, it's a lightly armed airborne division that can't take that heavy objective on their own. And so they're stopped on the southern approaches to Manila, what's called the Genko Line. You end up, of course, with a terrible urban battle in Manila with the 37th Infantry Division and the 1st Cavalry Division coming from the other side, as you see there, fighting this close-in, block-by-block fight largely in February 1945. It's a monumental tragedy. It's the essential dilemma we have faced from the beginning of this invasion, and why some at the grand strategical level have thought going to the Philippines was not the best idea. Because in order to liberate our friends, we must destroy their homes, their property, themselves, because war has now come to their home. We had the same dilemma in France, in Belgium, in Netherlands, in Luxembourg, sort of in Italy. It's the same thing in the Philippines. And so the Filipinos, again, pay the major price for their own liberation, especially in this horrifying battle. So this urban combat rages on throughout that month, and it's just a block by block thing. So by the time it's done, and you can see, some of it's just staggering to look at that, isn't it? Tens of thousands of Filipinos lose their lives, a mixture of the firepower, of course, and a wave of horrifying Japanese atrocities against the population. About 16,000 Japanese die in this fighting, and about 1,000 Americans in this block-by-block struggle. Interestingly, by the way, the Americans use fire quite a bit to take this battlefield, and you've seen that pattern in the war towards the end. Of course, firebombing of Japan that starts in March 1945, and then you have flame tanks that are going to be used Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And then in this case, we've got flamethrower teams and sometimes just engineers pouring gasoline into Japanese-controlled buildings and burning them out. Horrifying thing. So the destruction of the city. So think about trying to, as well, continue our operations, and then the humanitarian side to this, of taking care of the population, and then sustain and have all the logistics. This is the challenge. So where this goes from here, and to get into the latter phases of it, is that MacArthur gives Eichelberger and 8th Army the orders to clear out something of the rest of the Philippines, the other islands, on the southern part of our map and beyond. So this goes on over the spring and early summer of 1945. 8th Army will carry out 35 plus amphibious operations. It is again a masterpiece in amphibious operational art. They liberate some 7 million people. They suffer 2,000 killed and about 7,000 wounded, kill untold numbers of Japanese soldiers, and really just succeed at every level in some pretty tough fighting at times. Why don't we know that much about it? Because it's kind of strategically pointless. You're going in the wrong direction from Tokyo. And so this is not all that well known, but MacArthur felt this was important to do because he was worried about Japanese atrocities against the population and mistreatment of Filipinos and wanted them liberated as soon as possible. So you have that, in addition to, of course, the fighting in Luzon continues to the end of the war. Very unglamorous, very much just a grinding kind of thing, mainly in the northern part of the island. And I just want to give you a quick snapshot into that fighting and the nature of it. These are basically battles of annihilation against desperate groups of Japanese. And in heat, insects, rain, mud, privation, it's very much an infantryman's fight to a great extent. The infantry took about 90% of the casualties for the Americans. The violence of it was appalling. One example, 4 months on the line, the 130th Infantry Regiment of the 33rd Division expended 44,000 mortar shells, 6,400 105 millimeter self-propelled rounds, about 30,000 grenades, and 1.4 million machine gun bullets. The regimental staff calculated that on average, the expenditure of, get this, 300 pounds of ordnance for every casualty inflicted upon the Japanese. 300 pounds of ordnance. Think about all the shipping that took for that ordnance, and then to move it to where it needed to go, much less fire it off at whatever targets you've got. So 6th Army, by the end of the war, as this thing peters out, reported about 38,000 battle casualties. But I would argue that's kind of disingenuous. When you look at disease, immersion foot, combat fatigue, all those things that relate to combat, the casualty numbers were over 93,000. Okay, so that's almost on par with the Battle of Normandy, by the way. So it's kind of comparable to the grinding fall 44 campaign that Eisenhower's armies fought, to the Argonne Forest in World War I, and Grant's Overland campaign in 1864. So the war ends, and we end up with some legacies here in Luzon, but I would argue the larger war that I'll conclude on. We've seen the Army transform into from a small provincial force into a modern, lavishly equipped, techno-rich, mechanized army, arguably, as I said, the most potent ground arm on the planet. In Asia, from the Asian perspective, the war was really kind of just beginning. You have post-colonial strife, bloodshed, upheaval. Of course, the Cold War cost something in the order of about 10 million lives in the decades to come. Some of them American, by the way, in places called Korea and Vietnam. So really, the war is just beginning. The conflict is just beginning from the perspective of many people in the Pacific and Asia. Of course, another key legacy is the Chinese Civil War and its outcome, and a major reason why many of us are here today. That is absolutely a legacy of World War II and of the Army's struggle in World War II to forge a productive alliance with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese, one of the most ill-fated alliances in American history. Speaking of alliances, we have then in place at the end of World War II an alliance structure that is still in place today as we look around and see. Okay? And specifically, I would point to some very, very close alliances with Australia and New Zealand that very much come out of World War II. Believe it or not, about 1 million American servicemen either passed through or were stationed in Australia at some point in World War II. Think about everything that means culturally for both peoples and does ever since. It's a remarkable, remarkable thing. And the last legacy, I would say, the savagery of the combat has set the tone that has been in place ever since and is much more analogous to what we've experienced ever since World War II than the European theater was, where you have some level of rules of warfare. In this war, the Japanese recognized no such rules as Americans would have wanted to have them, and the Americans then had to decide, what do we do? How do we respond to that? Do we follow rules? Do we not? And I would argue all of our conflicts have been that way ever since. So, last point, from Korea to Afghanistan, and we see this is kind of the harbinger, about 90% of US casualties have occurred in ground combat, in spite of all the other revolutionary changes we've had to warfare since then. So, in that sense, the war was really more of a beginning than an end. So I'll conclude on that note. If there are any questions, I'd love to take them. Thank you, appreciate it.
Hey, John, thanks again. What an incredible presentation to all of us. Mick Bednarik, Floor Corporation. Real quick, and maybe a softball question for you, but as we strive to remember and learn the lessons of military history, and we look to the future of the joint force. So from the past that you've highlighted, not only the Battle of Luzon, but as we look to the future, what key takeaway would you recommend to us as we learn from those historical vignettes that you've highlighted as we look to the future of the joint force? Thank you.
So I would say, I mean, this is self-serving. I would say history is so front and center as a force multiplier that you absolutely have to learn from the successes, the mistakes of others in the past in order to have any sense of how you're going to approach whatever problems you have ahead of you. I think also, too, jointness. This is where I think you see in World War II the beginning of the jointness that we take for granted today. And I think MacArthur's team is kind of an example of that. Kincaid and also Admiral Daniel Barbet, who were very, very close to MacArthur's staff at this point in working the operations they needed to do. George Kenney, his aerial commander, is a remarkable commander, and I think they have melded that extremely well. I think cultural understanding is another element of this. We got away in World War II with not having the kind of cultural understanding that we are going to need to going forward. And I mean that in terms of whatever the operational area happens to be, but also all these partners. The Americans and the Filipinos get on reasonably well in World War II, but one of the reasons is because the Japanese and the Filipinos didn't quite as much as the Americans did. I think that there's a lesson there that we need to be better at that. Those are the three that off the top of my head, there's probably more if I had more time to think about it, but yeah, I would say those are the three that are front and center.
Ken Kraetzer, Cam Vets Media. Dr. McManus, great talk. One of my uncles served in the battles in the Philippines and the U.S. Army. We've done a lot of research on casualties, names we read on Memorial Day. One turned out to be a soldier who died in what was said to be the largest tank battle in the Philippines conflict. Do you recall that one in your research?
You mean in 1945?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So the Japanese had the equivalent of about an armored brigade in like the central part of Luzon. Now, they will attack from the east. It's one of the things Kruger had worried about is counterattacks the Japanese would have coming from the east that might cut his supply lines leading down to Manila. The Japanese will launch this tank attack, but honestly, they're kind of outclassed. We tend to forget, I think, that the Pacific War was a tankers war as well, especially as we get later into the war. MacArthur has the equivalent of about a division's worth of armor. It's just not organized the same way that we do in Europe. So the Americans have qualitatively better tanks, they're better organized, they have more firepower. And so the Japanese, in a way, with that is the biggest tank battle. There's another smaller one in 1940, either 41 or 42 in the first campaign that involves the 192nd Tank Battalion on the US side. But in this one, in 45, the Japanese are kind of just launching their tanks out almost as sacrificial lambs. And so they don't have much chance to affect the campaign.
Thank you, sir. Sir, thank you for being here. Let's give Dr. McManus a big round of applause.
Thank you, Dr. McManus.